Susan, I am going to start with you. There are lots of folks who would argue that Donald Trump ran for office to avoid prosecution and that worked. What kind of message does this send to the rest of the world?
Well, it did work. Whatever you think of the merits of the case, the fact is that there's not going to be a case against Donald Trump in which that evidence is going to be presented in a court of law with sworn witnesses and testimony 4 years after the fact. And whether you think it was a good idea or not to bring the cases, certainly the people who decided to launch the investigations in such a way that they couldn't be completed before the election year have seen, I think, the complete collapse and the failure of that strategy. And, it's not just, therefore, a political failure on the part of Democrats to be defeated by Donald Trump, but it represents the collapse of an effort that they very solemnly said was necessary to hold the former president accountable for his actions. So they have neither accountability nor political success as a result of this years-long effort. And, I think this is something that historians and legal scholars are going to be poring over for a long time. But today is one of those days, as you said in the introduction, Simone, where elections have consequences. Today is the collapse of the legal cases against Trump and the full spectrum of what he's proposing to do to the country. He's already putting the U.S. economy in an uproar with our neighbors, Canada and Mexico and China, our three largest trading partners, already in an uproar, even though we're nowhere near the inauguration day itself yet.
Tyler, Susan makes such a poignant point there. I mean, the turmoil is above the 20. It's about the 25% tariffs, blanket tariffs on Mexico, goods coming from Canada and Mexico that the president-elect said would take effect on January 20th today. He posted that on Truth Social. We'll dig into that more in just a moment because there are very real consequences for elections. And I have talked to a number of Democrats today. I've talked to a number of people who formerly worked within the Justice Department. And in all of the conversations that I've had, there has been lots of finger pointing, shall we say, that these prosecutions took so long to get going. What is your reporting telling you? And the finger pointing is not at Jack Smith. It's at Main Justice, as the Department of Justice folks would say, for the Attorney General Merrick Garland and his deputies, because those are the folks that made the decisions.
Yeah, we've seen these frustrations at Merrick Garland from the Biden White House and from allies of the president and the broader Democratic Party for years at this point. This has been one of the things they bring up pretty immediately when you talk about the relationship between the White House and the Justice Department and just the broader judicial landscape of this administration, frustrated that these charges, they say, were not brought sooner. However, when you talk to people inside the Justice Department, their contention is at any step of the way, this was going to be caught up in the Supreme Court. We've seen that happen already. They say they moved as expeditiously as possible. And even if they were to try to bring these charges earlier, it would have taken more than 4 years, just given the hurdles and the way that our legal system works with multiple avenues for appeal and the pace at which the Supreme Court would take up these cases. Now, that is a lot of in the weeds judicial and legalese about how these cases were brought against Trump. But it is undoubtedly true that there are many people in the White House and in the broader Democratic Party that are frustrated by the way that these cases were handled. And this dates back to the transition when Biden won in 2020 and an argument his aides had over how to restore independence and trust in the Justice Department. There were two camps in that transition, one that wanted someone like Merrick Garland in particular, who was a former federal or then a federal judge nominated to the Supreme Court. They felt that he was the best to restore that independence. Others wanted Doug Jones, the Alabama senator, who they thought would better be able to navigate this political moment. Obviously, the Merrick Garland camp went out, and we're seeing the results of that sort of mentality. But it is undoubtedly true that this has been a sore spot for many in Biden's orbit for quite some time.
You know, Jasmine, I had a smirk on my face as Tyler was talking because I was advising the Biden campaign at that time and worked as a member of the transition as then Vice President-elect spokesperson. And I remember that debate vividly. Hindsight is 20/20, but I'm sure, especially today, there are a number of Democrats saying, should have picked Doug Jones. Elections have consequences.
I think they've been saying that for like 2-3 years.
They've been saying it for a couple of years.
There you go.
But elections have consequences, as we've been saying now for weeks. And the consequences of an election, if you win, is you get to pick the cabinet.
Yep.
And the president-elect, his cabinet is coming to clearer focus. Let's talk about these cabinet picks, because I think there's been a lot of focus on maybe some of the character, if you will.
Yeah.
But cabinet picks and public service is about qualifications, character, and I mean, also maybe kind of adherence to rule of law, which some people could put in character, but nowadays I think it needs its own bucket. What is your reporting telling you about this cabinet, some of the picks? We've heard a lot about Pam Bondi for AG, previously Matt Gaetz. We've heard a lot about Pete Hegseth, but there are others.
Yeah, there are others. I would say that outside of maybe 1 or 2 or 3, a lot of them are not really a surprise, particularly to Republicans, and especially for people who have been watching Trump campaigns, because most of these people, like Pam Bondi, like Tulsi Gabbard, like RFK Jr., like some other folks, were not just Fox News darlings, but we're also at Trump rallies, kind of the opening acts for him across the country as he made his case to the American people why he should be elected. And so I think that these are people who are the people who support Trump or follow Trump are at least somewhat familiar with, if not comfortable with. Now, certainly there are names that have been coming up over and over again. Of course, Matt Gaetz was one of them, and now he has stepped down from that role, taken himself out of the nomination. Tulsi Gabbard, Director of National Intelligence nominee, she is somebody that, of course, Democrats are pretty concerned about because of her history with Russia and Putin and Syria and that trip that she took in 2017 when she was a Democrat in the House. But also some Republicans have voiced some concern to me and folks at Notice who have been reporting on this. And some of it stems from the fact that some of these candidates or nominees aren't getting background checks. The former president will be president-elect. Hasn't gone through the GSA processes to really affirm that process to make sure that these people are going through the traditional checks that other nominees have in the past with other administrations. And so there are concerns about a number of people. That is not to say, though, Simone, that these people will not be confirmed. I think that the Republicans in the Senate want to provide Trump with a lot of deference on who he chooses. That doesn't mean that they're not going to say something. That doesn't mean that they're not going to go through a difficult confirmation process. But they certainly want to give deference to Trump, and they want Trump to be giving them people who they can confirm in a kind of speedy way so that they are prepared to take office very quickly after inauguration. But I think that there are some names that concern them. Certainly Tulsi Gabbard, certainly Pete Hegseth, I've heard complaints about from both sides that maybe they are not ready for those roles or they're not qualified for those roles. But I don't think that means by any chance that we should not necessarily expect them to be confirmed.
What a world we are in. Yes, qualifications, folks, I do still think they matter. Let's talk tariffs, folks, for a second, because when it comes to actual policy, Tyler, we saw on the president-elect's social media account tonight, he wrote that one of his first executive actions will be a 25% across-the-board tariff on Mexico and Canada, unless they curb the flow of fentanyl into the United States. Now, Donald Trump's pick for Treasury, he is seen as moderate on tariffs. He is seen as someone, frankly, that has said tariffs should be used as a negotiating tactic, but they need to be targeted. They're not all bad, but you just can't have blanket tariffs. But then you've got his pick for Commerce Secretary, who was also the person who currently leads his transition effort. And the Commerce Secretary is going to be the person who is actually implementing the tariffs. And he is much more in Donald Trump's camp on these blanket tariffs. How is this going to play out?
I mean, that is a question that is very impossible to answer when it comes to the way that Donald Trump makes policy. And I think that's part of what his supporters like. He is bold, he is brash, he makes a lot of pronouncements, not through the traditional policy process. Something like this would often go through the National Economic Council at the White House, where you would have meetings of the cabinet secretaries and other key advisors, and you'd come to a recommendation. That's not how Trump operates. It's not how he did the first term in office. It's not clearly how he's going to do his second term. So I think that's important context to understand when we see these sorts of policy pronouncements. Oftentimes, this is not exactly what's going to happen, but it's an opening salvo, the way that Trump wants to rile up some allies, some enemies, some competitors, and sort of get people talking about what he wants to do and ultimately get the result that is going to maybe look a little bit different than this. I think we've already seen some jittery markets, so the capitals, foreign capitals of these countries and their embassies in Washington are very rapidly responding in real time to this pronouncement. It is giving us flashbacks to Trump's first term when he would make policy by tweet, and it would cause chaos in the markets and in the diplomatic circles. So I think this is one of those examples, again, where it's still early. It's still many weeks until he takes the oath of office. And I think we will see this evolve over time. But it is undoubtedly true that Trump is a fan of tariffs. He wants to be tough on both allies and adversaries. And so we should expect this type of rhetoric and these types of policies. How it exactly is implemented, I think, is the big question that many people across the country and across the world are waiting to see once he takes office.